Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor, the heavy droplets distorting the neon city lights bleeding up from the Seattle streets below. The corporate offices of Vance Global Solutions were a tomb at this hour. The only sound was the rhythmic drumming of the storm and the hum of the HVAC system. Arthur sat alone in his cubicle, the harsh, artificial glow of his dual monitors illuminating the exhaustion carved into his face. He rubbed his eyes, trying to make sense of the financial projections on the screen, but his mind kept drifting to the manila folder sitting ominously on the edge of his desk. He didn't need to open it to know what was inside. Final notices. A stack of medical bills from St. Jude's Oncology. $142,500. The cost of keeping his mother alive for another 6 months. The bank had called twice today about the foreclosure on his childhood home. He was drowning, and working 80-hour weeks as a junior executive wasn't even keeping his head above water. Suddenly, the silence of the empty office was shattered by the buzzing of his cell phone. Arthur flinched. He glanced at the glowing screen. Caller ID, Julian Vance. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. Julian Vance was the CEO and founder of the company, a billionaire who moved through the world with the untouchable grace of a predator. Julian didn't call junior executives, and he certainly didn't call them at 11:15 p.m. on a Friday. Arthur cleared his throat and swiped to answer. Mr. Vance? This is Arthur. Arthur, Julian's voice came through the speaker. It wasn't the smooth, charismatic baritone that commanded boardrooms. It was clipped. Frayed. Breathless. Are you still at the office? Yes, sir. Just finishing up the Q3 projections like you asked. I don't care about the projections, Julian interrupted, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I need you at my penthouse. Right now. Use the private elevator. Do not speak to the doorman. Just get up here. Sir? Is everything Al? The line went dead. Arthur stared at the phone. A cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. He shoved his laptop into his satchel, grabbed his coat, and hurried toward the executive elevator bank. His security badge barely registered on the scanner before the steel doors parted. Julian's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the adjacent Vance Tower. The ride up took less than a minute, but to Arthur, it felt like an eternity. When the elevator doors chimed and slid open, they revealed the sprawling, opulent foyer of Julian's residence. Usually, the penthouse was pristine, a masterpiece of minimalist Italian leather, dark mahogany, and modern art. Tonight, it was a war zone. An antique side table had been smashed to splinters. A heavy crystal decanter lay in pieces on the white marble floor, a pool of amber scotch soaking into a priceless Persian rug. Mr. Vance. Arthur called out, his voice trembling. In the study, Arthur. Close the elevator doors. Arthur stepped into the penthouse, the doors whispering shut behind him. He walked slowly toward the study, the heavy oak doors left ajar. The smell hit him before he saw anything. It was the sharp, coppery scent of pennies, mixed with the harsh tang of the spilled scotch. Arthur pushed the door open, and the breath completely left his lungs. Lying in the center of the room, face down on the hardwood floor, was Marcus Lynn. Marcus was the company's senior internal auditor, a quiet, meticulous man who always smelled of peppermint and stale coffee. He wasn't moving. A thick, dark pool of crimson was expanding rapidly around his head, soaking into the collar of his pale blue dress shirt. A few feet away lay a heavy, solid bronze bookend, slick with gore. Oh my God, Arthur choked out, stumbling backward. Oh my God, Marcus. We have to call an ambulance. I'll call 911. Put the phone down, Arthur. Julian emerged from the shadows near the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. He looked nothing like the polished titan of industry from the magazine covers. His tailored suit jacket was discarded. His expensive white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the cuffs rolled up to his elbows. His hands and the right sleeve of his shirt were stained with bright, fresh blood. "He's dead, Arthur. An ambulance isn't going to do him any good," Julian said. His voice was terrifyingly calm now, the panic from the phone call completely masked. You killed him," Arthur stammered, his fingers slick with sweat as he gripped his phone. "Julian, what did you do?" "It was self-defense," Julian said, pouring himself a drink from a secondary bar cart with a remarkably steady hand. He took a sip, grimacing. "Marcus came here unannounced. He was hysterical. He had been digging into the offshore accounts. The Cayman ledgers. He found the discrepancies. He accused me of embezzling company funds to prop up my private equity ventures." "Did you?" Arthur asked, the realization dawning on him. The missing funds. The weird gaps in the Q2 reports Arthur had been told to ignore. Julian waved a dismissive hand. "Corporate finances are a fluid concept, Arthur. I was restructuring. Marcus didn't see it that way. He threatened to go to the SEC. When I told him to calm down, he picked up a paperweight. He swung at me. I grabbed the bookend to defend myself. It was an accident." Arthur looked at the body. Marcus was a frail man in his late 50s. The blow that killed him had clearly struck the back of his skull. You don't hit a man in the back of the head in self-defense, Arthur thought, a wave of nausea washing over him. This wasn't an accident. It was an execution. "I'm calling the police," Arthur said, his voice shaking but resolute. He started dialing. "If you do that, Arthur, your mother will be dead by Christmas." Arthur froze. His thumb hovered over the call button. He slowly looked up at his boss. Julian set his glass down and walked slowly toward Arthur, his bloody shoes leaving faint red tracks on the floor. "I know everything about my employees, Arthur. I know you are a brilliant, hard-working young man. I also know you are drowning. $142,000 to St. Jude's. Your house is in foreclosure. Your credit is destroyed. If you lose this job, she loses her treatments." Julian stepped closer, his eyes locked onto Arthur's. The predatory aura was back, suffocating and heavy. "You call the police," Julian continued softly, "and this company plummets into a scandal. The stock crashes. We freeze all assets. Thousands of people lose their jobs, including you. The bank takes your home on Monday. And your mother." Julian let the sentence hang in the air, a venomous threat wrapped in velvet. Arthur's hands began to shake uncontrollably. Tears stung the corners of his eyes. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. "I need a partner. Someone I can trust," Julian said, his tone shifting from threatening to deeply sympathetic. "If you help me clean this up, if you help me protect this company, our employees, and your family, I will wire $200,000 to your personal account by 8 a.m. tomorrow. Completely untraceable. I will pay off the house. And on Monday, I will announce your promotion to Vice President of Acquisitions." Julian reached out and placed a bloody hand on Arthur's shoulder, ruining his coat. "You can save her, Arthur. You have the power to fix your entire life right now. Or, you can throw it all away for a man who is already dead. The choice is yours." Arthur looked at Marcus's lifeless body. He thought of his mother, frail and pale in her hospital bed, smiling through the pain of the chemotherapy. He thought of the bank notices. He thought of the crushing, suffocating weight of his poverty. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, the morality that had guided his 26 years of life had fractured. "What do we do?" Arthur asked, his voice hollow. Julian smiled. A cold, shark-like grin. "That's my boy." For the next 2 hours, Arthur descended into a nightmare. Under Julian's direction, he became an accessory to murder. He found a box of heavy-duty black trash bags in the kitchen. Using industrial bleach and a sponge, Arthur scrubbed the marble floors, fighting back the urge to vomit as the chemicals mixed with the smell of iron. He took the bronze bookend, heavy and sticky, and wrapped it tightly in 3 layers of plastic. Julian had already called a specialist to deal with the body, someone who operated entirely off the books and would make Marcus disappear without a trace. But the weapon, and the digital footprint, were Arthur's responsibility. Marcus badged out of the office at 6:00 p.m., Julian instructed, handing Arthur an encrypted USB drive. You used to work in the IT department before you transitioned to finance. You know how the security servers operate. You need to alter the building logs. Make it look like Marcus came back to the office at 9 p.m., and left the building through the loading dock doors at 11:42 p.m. That puts him on the streets, in the worst part of downtown, in the middle of a storm. A robbery gone wrong. They'll never trace it back to the penthouse. At 1:30 a.m., Arthur found himself sitting in the driver's seat of his beat-up sedan. The storm outside was raging harder than before. Beside him on the passenger seat was the black plastic bag containing the murder weapon. He drove out to the industrial district, toward the abandoned iron bridge that spanned the deepest, most treacherous part of the Snohomish River. The rain whipped against his face as he stepped out of the car. The wind howled, drowning out the sound of his own ragged breathing. He stood at the edge of the bridge, looking down into the churning, black water below. With a guttural cry of frustration and self-loathing, Arthur hurled the bag into the void. It disappeared into the darkness, followed seconds later by a faint splash that was immediately swallowed by the storm. He drove back to the Vance Global building. His hands moved mechanically across the keyboard in the dark, frigid server room. He bypassed the firewalls he had helped build 3 years ago. He found the access logs. Delete. Rewrite. Save. User, Marcus_Lin. Action, badge out. Location, loading dock C. Timestamp, 23 hours and 42 minutes. It was done. Arthur walked out of the building and stood under the awning as the rain poured down. He looked at his hands. They were clean, scrubbed raw with soap and hot water. But as the neon lights flickered over him, he couldn't shake the sensation that they were stained irreversibly red. He had sold his soul to Julian Vance. He just didn't know yet how high the interest rate was going to be. 6 months later, the rain had surrendered to the bitter, biting chill of a Seattle winter, but the cold inside Arthur's chest had nothing to do with the weather. He stood by the sprawling, floor-to-ceiling windows of his new corner office on the 60th floor. The view was spectacular, a panoramic sweep of the Puget Sound, with ferries cutting through the steel-gray water and the Olympic Mountains looming like silent sentinels in the distance. The office itself was a masterpiece of corporate luxury. Polished walnut desk, imported leather couches, a private espresso bar, and a sleek glass door bearing a frosted inscription, Arthur Pendleton, Vice President of Acquisitions. He had everything he had ever wanted. The $200,000 had materialized in a pristine, offshore account exactly as Julian had promised. St. Jude's Oncology had been paid in full. The foreclosure on his childhood home was a distant memory. Just yesterday, his mother had called him, her voice vibrating with a strength he hadn't heard in years, to tell him her latest scans showed the tumors were shrinking. He had saved her life. But as Arthur looked at his reflection in the cold glass of the window, he barely recognized the man staring back. He had lost 15 pounds he couldn't afford to lose. Deep, bruised-looking shadows hung beneath his eyes, the permanent toll of a mind that refused to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in that penthouse. He could smell the copper and the spilled scotch. He could feel the horrific, sticky weight of the bronze bookend in his hands. Every sudden noise, a dropped stapler, a door slamming, the sudden chime of an elevator sent a spike of pure, unadulterated adrenaline through his veins, leaving him breathless and trembling. The police investigation had concluded exactly as Julian had predicted. 2 weeks after the murder, a weary homicide detective named Ramirez had sat in Arthur's old cubicle, asking routine questions. Did Mr. Lin seem agitated? Do you know why he left through the loading dock? Arthur had lied with a terrifying smoothness, regurgitating the altered server logs he had created. The police, overworked and underfunded, quickly classified Marcus Lin's death as a tragic, random mugging in a notoriously bad part of the city. A closed case. Arthur thought the guilt would be the hardest part to live with. He was wrong. The hardest part was Julian Vance. Arthur, a voice purred from the doorway. Arthur flinched, his coffee splashing over the rim of his mug and burning his knuckles. He spun around to see Julian leaning casually against the doorframe. The CEO looked immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his eyes bright with that signature, shark-like charisma. "Julian," Arthur said, quickly setting the mug down and wiping his hand with a napkin. "I didn't hear you come in." "You were a million miles away," Julian said, strolling into the office as if he owned it, which, of course, he did. He dropped a thick, unmarked black folder onto Arthur's pristine walnut desk. "I need your signature on these authorizations by noon. The wire transfers need to clear before the Asian markets open." Arthur looked at the folder. Over the past 3 months, the nature of his promotion had become terrifyingly clear. He wasn't the vice president of acquisitions. He was the vice president of dirty laundry. Hesitantly, Arthur opened the folder. He scanned the first page. It was a transfer authorization for $18 million to an entity called Apex Logistics, routed through a bank in the Cayman Islands. Arthur swallowed hard. "Julian, we looked into Apex Logistics last week. They don't have any physical assets. They don't have trucks, they don't have warehouses. The address listed on their incorporation papers is a vacant lot in Delaware. This is a shell company." "Very observant, Arthur. That's why you're the VP," Julian smiled, stepping closer to the desk. "But the funds you're moving, this capital is coming directly from the Employee Pension Reserve. You're draining the retirement fund to pump money into a ghost company. If the SEC audits this..." "The SEC isn't going to audit us, Arthur, because our internal records will show that Apex Logistics is a highly lucrative, emerging supply chain partner. And those records will show that you, the brilliant VP of Acquisitions, vetted them thoroughly and authorized the partnership." Julian tapped the signature line on the document with a manicured fingernail. "Sign the paper, Arthur." Arthur's hands trembled. He looked up at Julian, his breathing turning shallow. "Julian, I can't do this. I helped you with Marcus because it was a moment of panic. An accident. But this is systematic fraud. If this collapses, thousands of our employees lose their life savings. I can't sign my name to this." The warmth vanished from Julian's face instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating emptiness. "You seem to be suffering from a fundamental misunderstanding of our relationship, Arthur. You are not my partner. You are my employee. I bought your mother's life. I bought your house. I bought you. You will sign the paper, and you will ensure the transfer goes through flawlessly. Do we understand each other?" Julian didn't wait for an answer. He simply turned and walked out of the office, leaving the heavy black folder sitting on the desk like an unexploded bomb. Arthur collapsed into his leather chair, burying his face in his hands. The walls of his luxurious office suddenly felt like a prison cell shrinking around him. He was the fall guy. Julian was insulating himself. Every illegal transfer, every falsified environmental report, every phantom shell company, Arthur's signature was on all of it. If Vance Global ever went down, Julian would walk away clean, pointing the finger at his rogue, overambitious VP of Acquisitions. "I have to get out," Arthur thought, his heart hammering against his ribs. I have enough money saved now. I can move Mom to a clinic in Switzerland. Or Canada. I can disappear. The idea took root, blossoming from a desperate fantasy into a concrete plan of survival. He couldn't keep doing this. The stress was killing him faster than the poverty ever had. He would resign. He would pack his bags, leave the country, and never look back. For the next 3 days, Arthur worked in a state of hyper-focused frenzy. He liquidated his assets, quietly transferring his funds to a secure, decentralized crypto wallet. He booked 2 first-class, one-way tickets to Geneva under assumed names. He packed his apartment into 3 suitcases. On Friday afternoon, precisely at 4:45 p.m., Arthur printed out a single sheet of paper. His resignation letter. It was brief, citing health reasons and personal family matters for his immediate departure. He took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and marched toward the executive elevator. He rode up to the penthouse office, the same floor where Marcus Lynn had bled out onto the Persian rug. The memory threatened to choke him, but Arthur pushed it down. He was done being a victim. Julian's secretary was gone for the day. Arthur walked straight into the CEO's sprawling office. Julian was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, reviewing a tablet. He didn't look up as Arthur approached. "I told you I didn't want to be disturbed until 5, Julian murmured, swiping a finger across the screen. Arthur slapped the resignation letter face down onto the center of Julian's desk. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet room. Julian finally stopped. He looked at the piece of paper, and then slowly raised his eyes to meet Arthur's. He didn't look angry. He looked vaguely amused. "What is this?" "I'm done, Julian," Arthur said. His voice shook slightly, but he forced himself to stand tall. "I'm resigning, effective immediately. The medical debts are paid. I did what you asked me to do 6 months ago. I've signed enough of your fraudulent paperwork to build an empire. But I am not doing it anymore. I want out." Julian leaned back in his plush leather chair, steepling his fingers together. He stared at Arthur for a long, agonizing minute. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight in the room. Then, Julian sighed. It was a disappointed, paternal sound. "Sit down, Arthur." "No. I have nothing left to say to you. I'm leaving." Arthur turned toward the door. "I wouldn't take another step if I were you," Julian said. The icy venom in his voice froze Arthur in his tracks. "Unless you want the police to know exactly how Marcus Lynn spent his final moments." Arthur turned back, his stomach dropping into an endless abyss. "The police closed the case." "You told me." "The police closed a case based on a fiction you created," Julian corrected him smoothly. He picked up the sleek, silver tablet he had been reviewing and tapped the screen a few times. He slid the tablet across the polished mahogany desk toward Arthur. "Come here. Watch this." Trembling, Arthur approached the desk. He looked down at the glowing screen. His blood ran instantly cold. The video on the screen was crystal clear, shot in high definition from a high, downward-facing angle. It was footage of Julian's penthouse study. Arthur watched in mounting horror as the digital version of himself appeared on the screen. The footage showed Arthur on his hands and knees, scrubbing frantically at a massive pool of blood on the marble floor with a bleach-soaked sponge. His face was twisted in a rictus of panic. The silent video cut to another angle, Arthur carefully wrapping the blood-stained bronze bookend in plastic. Another cut showed Arthur slipping the security USB drive into his pocket. What is this?" Arthur whispered, the air leaving his lungs. "It's a hidden security camera, Arthur. Integrated into the smoke detectors. It records 24/7 to an encrypted cloud server," Julian explained, his voice conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. "But," Arthur stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. You aren't in the video. It only shows me. Julian smiled, a terrifying display of perfectly white teeth. Yes. Remarkable how that worked out, isn't it? I have a knack for knowing exactly where the camera's blind spots are. I stood by the bookshelves the entire time. Out of frame. Arthur stared at the tablet. The footage was damning. To anyone watching it without context, it didn't look like a terrified young man covering up a crime for his boss. It looked exactly like a cold-blooded murderer meticulously destroying the evidence of his own heinous act. If you walk out that door, Arthur, Julian said softly, I press one button. This video goes directly to Detective Ramirez. It will also go to the Seattle Times and the local news networks. How do you think it will look? A junior executive, drowning in massive debt, suddenly gets a massive, untraceable cash infusion and a VP promotion just days after the company's internal auditor is brutally murdered? And then, here is high-definition video of that same junior executive wiping up the victim's blood. Arthur couldn't breathe. The walls of the office were spinning. He reached out and grabbed the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. They won't just arrest you, Arthur, Julian continued, driving the knife in deep and twisting it. They will freeze your accounts. They will seize the money you used to pay for your mother's treatments. She will be kicked out of her care facility before the end of the week. And you will spend the rest of your natural life in a concrete box. You set me up, Arthur choked out, tears of absolute despair spilling over his cheeks. From the very beginning. You knew you were going to do this. Julian stood up, walking around the desk. He picked up Arthur's resignation letter, crumpled it into a tight ball, and tossed it into the stainless steel wastebasket. I don't leave loose ends, Arthur. You are a valuable asset to Vance Global. But assets need to be controlled. Julian reached out and patted Arthur patronizingly on the cheek. Arthur was too paralyzed by shock to even flinch away. You aren't quitting, Arthur, Julian whispered, his breath hot against Arthur's ear. You are going to go back down to your beautiful office. You are going to authorize the transfer to Apex Logistics. And you are going to smile while you do it. Because you belong to me now. Forever. Julian stepped back, the charming CEO mask sliding flawlessly back into place. Have a wonderful weekend, Arthur. I expect those wire transfers completed by noon. Arthur stood frozen in the center of the office, staring at the paused frame of the video on the tablet. He looked at the digital version of himself, kneeling in the blood, and realized the horrifying truth. He hadn't covered up a crime to escape a trap. He had built the cage himself, handed Julian the key, and locked the door from the inside. For the next 4 months, Arthur Pendleton lived as a ghost haunting his own life. To the outside world, he was the meteoric rising star of Vance Global Solutions. He wore bespoke Italian suits that draped perfectly over his thinning frame. He drove a sleek, obsidian Lexus he barely remembered buying. He attended high society galas, smiling woodenly for the cameras while Julian Vance stood beside him, playing the role of the benevolent mentor. But inside the gilded cage of his 60th floor office, Arthur was rotting. Every morning, he logged into his secure terminal and signed away pieces of his soul. He authorized transfers to phantom corporations. He approved the liquidation of employee health benefit surpluses into untraceable offshore holding companies. He was the architect of a massive, invisible financial collapse, and Julian was the puppet master pulling his strings. The blackmail video played on a loop in Arthur's nightmares. Wiping the blood. Hiding the weapon. Julian had made it explicitly clear, the moment Arthur hesitated, the moment he showed even a fraction of rebellion, the video would be sent to Detective Ramirez. Arthur would lose his mother, his freedom, and his life. The turning point came on a Tuesday in early November. Arthur was sitting in a sterile, brightly lit hospital room, holding his mother's hand. The chemotherapy had worked. The aggressive treatments, funded entirely by the blood money sitting in Arthur's offshore account, had pushed the cancer into full remission. "You look so tired, my sweet boy," his mother whispered, reaching up to brush a stray lock of hair from his forehead. Her eyes, once clouded with pain, were clear and bright. "You work too hard for that, Mr. Vance. You saved me, Arthur. Now it's time you start living for yourself." Arthur squeezed her hand, swallowing the heavy lump in his throat. "I will, Mom. I promise." He left the hospital that afternoon, stepping out into the crisp, cold Seattle air. He didn't feel the crushing despair that usually accompanied him. Instead, a strange, profound clarity washed over him. He had paid his debt to the universe. His mother was safe. The money was already spent. Julian couldn't take her health back. Arthur realized with a sudden, diamond-hard certainty that he was no longer afraid of losing everything. He was only afraid of living the rest of his life as a slave. If Julian Vance wanted a monster, Arthur would give him one. The counteroffensive began that very night. Julian had made a fatal miscalculation. In his arrogance, he had assumed that Arthur's fear would paralyze him. More importantly, to make Arthur the perfect scapegoat, Julian had given him unrestricted, Level 1 administrative clearance to the company's entire financial mainframe. Julian forgot that before Arthur was a desperate finance executive, he was a brilliant systems architect in the IT department. Arthur didn't sleep for 72 hours. He locked the heavy oak doors of his office, drew the blinds, and went to work. He didn't just look at the accounts, he dismantled the entire financial architecture of Vance Global line by line. Using a series of encrypted, decentralized proxy servers he set up on a burner laptop, Arthur began tracing the digital footprints of the shell companies. Apex Logistics, Meridian Holdings, Blackwood Capital. They all led back to a single, heavily fortified digital vault in the Cayman Islands. Arthur deployed a sophisticated packet-sniffing algorithm he had designed years ago, slipping it quietly into the company's internal network. It took 3 days to bypass the firewalls, but when he finally broke through, the truth hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't just embezzlement. It was a Ponzi scheme of catastrophic proportions. Julian was draining the employee pension funds, the health reserves, and the company's operational capital to pay off massive, illicit gambling debts and failing private equity ventures. And then, deep in the archived correspondence files, Arthur found the Holy Grail. It was a drafted, unsent email from Marcus Lynn to the Securities and Exchange Commission, dated the very day of his murder. Marcus hadn't just suspected the fraud, he had downloaded the definitive proof. Julian hadn't killed Marcus in a sudden, panicked argument. It was a calculated assassination to stop the email from being sent. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, the glow of the monitors reflecting in his hollow, exhausted eyes. He had the motive. He had the financial records. But it wasn't enough. In a court of law, Julian's team of high-priced lawyers could easily pin the financial crimes on Arthur, using the very authorizations Julian had forced him to sign. Arthur needed a confession. He needed Julian on tape. 2 weeks later, the trap was set. Arthur requested an urgent, private meeting in Julian's penthouse office. He arrived precisely at 6 p.m. The skies outside were bruised with heavy, dark clouds, mirroring the night Marcus was killed. Julian was waiting behind his desk, nursing a glass of expensive scotch. He looked annoyed. "This better be important, Arthur. I have a dinner reservation at 8. "It's about the Vanguard transfer," Arthur said, his voice flat, devoid of the trembling subservience Julian was accustomed to. He walked to the center of the room and stopped. Taped securely to Arthur's chest, hidden beneath his tailored shirt, was a military-grade audio recorder. "What about it?" Julian sighed, taking a sip of scotch. "It's a routine liquidation. Sign the authorization and route the 40 million to the Meridian account. I'm not signing it, Julian, Arthur said. The silence that followed was deafening. Julian slowly lowered his glass. The charming facade melted away, revealing the cold, reptilian predator underneath. Excuse me. The Vanguard Fund contains the retirement savings of 3,000 employees, Arthur said, staring directly into Julian's eyes. If I authorize that transfer, the fund is completely insolvent. You're bankrupting them to cover your margin calls on the Blackwood venture. Julian stood up, his eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. Have you forgotten how this works, Arthur? Have you forgotten the video? I haven't forgotten anything, Arthur replied calmly. But I also know that if the company goes under, the SEC will seize the servers. They'll find the altered security logs. They might even look a little closer at how Marcus Lynn actually died. Julian let out a harsh, barking laugh. He walked out from behind his desk, closing the distance between them. You think you can threaten me? You sniveling little coward. I own you. If you don't sign that paper by tomorrow morning, I will send the video of you wiping up Marcus's blood to the police. I will ruin your life, Arthur. I killed Marcus because he was a nuisance who wouldn't learn his place. Don't make me do the same to you. Got it? The three words echoed triumphantly in Arthur's mind. A direct, unequivocal confession to murder and blackmail, recorded in crystal clear audio. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't back away. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket. Julian tensed, perhaps expecting a weapon. But Arthur simply pulled out a cheap, plastic burner phone and placed it gently onto the mahogany desk. What is this? Julian sneered. That, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling register, is your new reality. Julian stared at the phone, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face. Over the last 3 weeks, Arthur explained, pacing slowly across the thick carpet, I've compiled a dossier. It contains every single fraudulent wire transfer, the IP logs tracing the Cayman accounts back to your private estate, the unredacted draft of Marcus Lynn's whistleblower email to the SEC, and, as of 2 minutes ago, a high-fidelity audio recording of you admitting to premeditated murder and extortion. Julian's face went completely pale. The glass of scotch trembled slightly in his hand. You're bluffing. You don't have the clearance to bypass my firewalls. I built your firewalls, Julian, Arthur corrected him softly. And I built a backdoor. Arthur pointed to the burner phone. That dossier is currently sitting on a secure, decentralized server heavily encrypted on the dark web. It is attached to an automated scripted dead man's switch. Every 24 hours, at exactly midnight, I have to enter a complex, rotating 16-digit passcode to reset a timer. Julian stopped breathing. The reality of the situation was crashing down on him. If I am arrested, Arthur continued, his eyes locked onto Julian with unwavering intensity. If I go missing. If I am fired. If I am in a car accident. If I simply decide I don't feel like typing the code, the timer reaches 0. And the moment it does, that entire dossier is simultaneously emailed to the FBI, the SEC, the IRS, the Seattle Police Department Homicide Division, and the editorial boards of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. You wouldn't dare, Julian whispered, his voice cracking. The financial records have your signature on them. You'd be destroying yourself. You'll go to prison, Arthur. Yes. I probably will, Arthur conceded, a terrifying, genuine smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of a man who had already walked through hell and no longer feared the flames. I'll do 5 to 10 years in a minimum security, white-collar facility for corporate fraud. I can live with that. Because my mother's medical trust is completely legally insulated. She will be taken care of for the rest of her life. Arthur stepped right into Julian's personal space, forcing the billionaire to look up at him. But you, Julian. You won't go to a white-collar resort. You will be indicted for the first-degree murder of an internal auditor to cover up a billion-dollar Ponzi scheme. They will seize every asset you own. Your penthouse, your yachts, your offshore accounts gone. You will die in a federal penitentiary, completely penniless and disgraced. Julian staggered backward, his legs hitting the edge of a leather sofa. He collapsed onto it, the glass slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor. For the first time in his life, the great Julian Vance looked small. He looked terrified. So, here are the new rules, Arthur said, buttoning his suit jacket with meticulous precision. The Vanguard transfer is cancelled. You will slowly begin liquidating your private equity ventures and quietly injecting the capital back into the employee pension fund over the next 12 months until it is completely whole. You will never ask me to sign another fraudulent document. And you will never, ever mention that video again. Julian stared at the floor, his chest heaving, his mind frantically searching for a way out and finding absolutely nothing. He was trapped. Checkmate. Do you understand me, Julian? Arthur demanded, his voice cracking like a whip. Julian slowly raised his head. His eyes were defeated, hollow, and filled with a burning, impotent rage. He nodded once. I understand. Good. Arthur turned toward the heavy oak doors. I'll see you on Monday, Mr. Vance. Have a wonderful weekend. Arthur walked out of the penthouse, the doors whispering shut behind him. He stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the elevator descended, Arthur closed his eyes and took a long, deep breath. His hands weren't shaking anymore. His chest didn't feel tight. For the first time in 6 months, he felt the heavy, suffocating chain around his neck snap and fall away. He had walked into the building a victim, desperate and broken. He was walking out as the most powerful man in Vance Global Solutions. The loyalty trap had been sprung, but Arthur wasn't the one caught inside it anymore. He stepped out of the lobby and into the cool Seattle night. The rain had finally stopped.